South.
Oh, I wouldn't presume to say.
That's your job.
Yeah, that's my job.
Okay, folks.
You're broadcasting too, over YouTube. It's all set up for you, so all you gotta do is just press the green button when you get finished. You're good to go.
Oh, you got it already?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thanks. So I'll have to be nice now. This, of course, was to be Dee Soule speaking to us today about her ancestors and her husband's ancestors. Weird as it may seem, she is a descendant of the tribe that welcomed the folks at Plymouth. But weirder still, of course, is her husband had an ancestor on the Mayflower. So what a couple, huh? So she was not just going to talk about that, obviously, but she has studied, the situation there and who invited whom to eat what and when. And it's not according to the myths that we have, apparently. But she's ill, not with COVID, but a bad cold, and she couldn't talk, so she told me that yesterday. Well, you don't pick up the phone and call somebody to do a program in a day. So I thought, well, you'll have to put up with me. I've done this program, but it's been about 7 or 8 years ago, and I doubt if there's anybody here who saw it. But even if you did, you probably don't remember it. Not that I have no confidence in you, but next meeting, the 7th of February, will be Heidi Waldron. Heidi Waldron is the Director of Development at Bonnet Park, the new, beautiful to be park over here off of Sykes. And they used to give tours, but now they send people out to talk. So she's coming to talk to the Academy on February the 7th. Now, a couple of favorites, and someone already mentioned it earlier. We have two favorite speakers. One is Bruce Anderson, and one is Jack Jarman. And they'll both be with us in March. So that ought to be very entertaining. Bruce on politics, and Jack on Putin and the Ukraine. We should fill the place up for that. I think they said only 30 people could come, but I don't think we've reached that yet. So you can stay, Bonnie. You can't hear me?
I didn't say
What about if I'm right here? Well, if you don't mind if I sit, because I've been having a foot problem, so standing very long is not very good. But we're going to talk about some religion here before we get too far into it. One of the world's great heretics was Arian. Arian was at the Council of Nicaea, and if you are a church-going Christian, you probably know something about the Nicene Creed. There are denominations that use it. It's rather long, much longer than the the Apostles' Creed, about 3 times as long. It's an effort to cover all the bases. What happened when Constantine became emperor, he didn't like the mess that Christianity was in, just using layman's terms. Every bishop in his territory had a kind of way of looking at Christology, that is, the nature of Christ, the nature of the church. And this didn't sit well with a Roman who liked things neat and packaged and easy to follow. So he did call them to Nicaea, bishops from all around, to try and solve their differences. Now, you think that there are differences in Christianity today? There's nothing even remotely close to the wide differences in 325. But they did manage to create something which no one was real happy with, but we became used to it. That is, we meaning Christians throughout the centuries. And that is to have one God in 3 persons. Well, Arian didn't buy this. Arian says there's no way that Jesus is begotten of God and with God from the beginning, etc. He's the Son of God, but he's not God. Well, that didn't fit with the triune concept, and he was condemned as a heretic and run out. But his heresy survived, and not only that, but thrived. So within 100 years, throughout Western Europe, there were many following him, especially a group called the Visigoths. The Visigoths. Okay, so what that does is it brings us to the next one. There's the kingdom of the Visigoths, and Arianism was throughout that particular kingdom. Unfortunately, the bishop at Rome had by that time assumed that that bishop was the pontiff and that everybody should follow Roman Catholicism, not just any Catholicism, but Roman Catholicism. And so they wanted to get rid of this heretic, or the heretic religion, Arianism. How are you going to do it? The bishops at Rome had no army. They had no country. You know, the Roman Empire was collapsing in 325, 400, 500, been collapsing. There isn't a... So, what's around? A bunch of barbarians. But who are the barbarians that are doing pretty well amongst barbarians? Well, up in north of Belgium and northwest Germany, lowlands, there are people called the Franks. Now, the Franks were a West Germanic people, just as pagan as anything, worshiping the same group of gods and goddesses that the Germans were and the Scandinavians, and so that's why we have remnants of that in Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. We have plenty of those Scandinavian and Germanic peoples on our calendar. So anyway, so the bishop at Rome got the idea around 485 that they had to do something, and the Franks looked very strong. They were moving south, taking over the areas of northern, what would be France eventually, and what would take the name of the Franks. And so he went to the leader of that group of Franks, whose name was Clodovic. So at this point, you see, Franks are down about where that greenish color is. Goes to them and says, if you will wipe out for us, kill or convert all the Visigoths with their Arian heresy, you can become the king of the West. And you will be made not only a king and sanctified, but you'll be a true Roman Catholic. Says, okay, I'll join you boys. Sounds real good. He'd already married a Burgundian woman who was Christian. So she was on his case to become a Christian already. So when women speak, men often listen. So in his first few battles, most of the time, in his first few battles, he was not doing too well, and he looked up in the sky and he said, if you're a god, if you're real, like Clotilda says, help me to win this battle and I'll become a Christian. Now, we know Constantine had already done that and it worked for him, right? A lot of people have done that and it worked. So, sure enough, he won the battle. Sure enough, he was stuck at that point. And so the bishops baptized him. They brought him to Reims. We call it Reims. That's in what's called Champagne country. You probably know where it is. Big cathedral there. R-H-E-I-M-S, Reims is the name. They brought him there to anoint him. Because like David, you have to be anointed if you're going to be God's vicar on earth. Right? So you've got to anoint him. Well, the bishop there was in charge of it, and his name was Remy. If you go to Reims, you can see a lot about Remy and where he lived, supposedly. The building, of course, wouldn't be the same. Cathedral isn't the same. But there was a building there that was serving as a cathedral. So here he is, Clodovig, better known in modern French as Clovis, because if you watch out what you're doing, and I'll show you in a minute, you can get Clovis out of Clodovig. So there you have it. You can't see, though, can you? You can't see it. Can you see it? The people on this side. Clodovig, if you drop the sounds in the middle, those two phonemes, and that often happens as language evolves, you get Clovis. Now, if you drop the k off of it, which often happens as it's evolving into modern French, you get Louis. So all those 18 Louis that were kings of France come right off of this Clodovig, Clovis, Louis. Okay? That's a 300-400 year etymology. So he's anointed. The problem is they don't have anything that's standard traditional anointment. So Remy, being a good bishop, prayed to God that he would send, he or she, I think he just was praying that he would send a special ointment to anoint Clovis so that he would be the vicar of Christ and rule on earth under God's will. And sure enough, out of the sky drops, some angel brings it down, this anointment and this oil. So he was anointed, and from that point on, the French kings ruled by the grace of God. Now, what happened? I'll just jump forward for a little anecdote. French Revolution came, and the revolutionaries found that bottle of anointment because all the kings subsequent to had to go to Reims, had to go to Reims and be anointed. That's where Joan of Arc comes in. Joan of Arc took but Charles, over to Reims to be anointed. He was not king until that happened. So Joan of Arc, became the great saint that she is about 100 years ago for doing that. Well, the revolutionaries thought, we'll smash that bottle up. There won't be any more. So if a king comes back, tries to restore the monarchy, there won't be any anointment. Little did they know that another miracle happened. You know, Louis XVI was beheaded, Louis XVII disappeared, and Louis XVIII was an younger brother. So when Louis XVIII came along, lo and behold, a bishop found the bottle, and he got anointed, same as everybody before him. Well, that's not what we're talking about today, but anyway, there's marriage of Clovis and Clotilda. That she's the one who said, you ought to be a Christian. So she showed him the Bible. I don't know why, because he couldn't read. But I guess she showed him some pictures or some of the... But anyway, she helped in all of this process. Now, Clovis, he's calling there, baptized, anointed with the sacred oil. It's a great etching. And that's that's typically the way a Celtic warrior would look. I think this picture probably belongs in a book of Celts or something. But anyway, it's the same idea. Big mustache, long hair, and standing on a shield, held up by the men of his group with a shield, holding a spear. Anyway, so now one more anecdote. Every child born before 1970, when they were in grade school, studied an anecdote like we hear the cherry tree story about Washington. They hear a story about Clovis. Okay, it's about a vase, really a chalice, that was stolen or were raided in the cathedral at Soissons. Now the Franks were equal dividers of booty. The king didn't get any more booty than everybody else. Okay, so they drew lots, and everybody got something equally. Well, the lot for this chalice fell to a regular soldier, but the bishop had requested strongly to Clovis, they've gotten this chalice, it's sacred, please take it and bring it back. So Clovis said okay to his soldier, Giorafio Lodovico, somebody. I don't know his name, I don't think anybody does, because it's really just a story. He said, no, I'm a Frank, I'm a good Frank, we divide things, I cast my lot and this is mine. And then the king kept arguing with him, and the soldier just took the thing and threw it on the ground and busted it. Clovis bid his mind, bid his time, I suppose, and bid his tongue, probably. And the next time they had marshaled the troops together to do what sergeants do, to make sure they all equipped well and dressed well and got their equipment and so on. He goes up to this soldier and threw his axe on the ground. And the guy went down to pick it up, and Clovis cleaved him in the middle, cleaved him in two. Now, he's been made a Christian, remember? But nobody managed to talk to him about Christian ethics. So he cleaved. These kids learned the story about the vase of Soissons, but not since they rewrote history in the late 60s. Now, why won't it work? Oh, there we go. Okay, so the Franks then did the job that they were asked to do. They drove the Visigoths and the Arian heresy into Spain, where they stayed until, as you well know, the 15th century. So, anyway, and Arian heresy, by the way, go Google it. You'll see that Arian heresy is alive and well and living in Paris. That was a joke. So the Roman bishops were quite pleased that now the Visigoths were below the Pyrenees. And so the church in this area that's going to be France will always be, until the Revolution, the first daughter of the Roman Catholic Church, considered the first daughter. So here we are at the 511. Notice there's all kinds of kingdoms around. There's really lots more than that. There's Ostrogoths in northern Italy, Burgundians. You know, there is a province called Burgundy and some good wine in Burgundy. So there's still a Burgundy. There's Alemanni, which, by the way, gave its name to Germany in French. So the Germans are Allemands, according to the French. Anyway, so, and over there on the very left is Breton. That's another story. That's where the people who escaped from King Arthur's defeats, seeking to get away from the Saxons, got on boats and went over there and set up the Celtic kingdom in Breton. And that remained independent of France until the 16th century. And even when I was young and visiting France, there would be manifestations, demonstrations for Breton libre, free Celtic Britain. They teach the language still, although it's dying, of course. You can't keep it alive artificially. But if you go there, and you'll see a different culture than any other place in France, because it came from the Anglo-Saxons running the Celts out of Cornwall and Wales. So here, eventually, before Clovis dies, look at that dark green. That's all the kingdom of the Franks. Okay, see the Saxons up above? They're going to get it. Ostrogoths over in the right, Lombards down in northern Italy, and then the Visigoths south of there. Now, some of us just read a book about the Dark Ages, about something that took place around the turn of the millennium, and how dark it could be and was, and then, but this is from 511 to 700. Is pretty dark in Western Europe, but little by little, the popes in Rome are trying to tame everybody down and try to make them more or less good Christians. But, of course, barbarism existed, and the barbarians across the Rhine were continuing to press and press and press. In England, of course, it was the Danes and the Swedes and all the Scandinavians are pressing, and the Angles and the Saxons were Germanic, so England eventually becomes a North Germanic-speaking Anglo-Saxon country. France becomes not a Frankish-speaking country. This is interesting. The Franks were civilized enough early on that they said, you know that Roman tongue that people are talking? Latin. But it wasn't really Latin. It was the Roman soldier's tongue, which was just about as vulgar as it could be. Vulgar meaning popular, and vulgar too, as far as that goes. But that's not really the basic meaning. So that what they were speaking was not Frankish. It was not a West Germanic language. As a matter of fact, if you look in a French dictionary today, you'd be hard-pressed to find a single word that came from Frankish. There's a few military terms, the word for hatchet, for example, hatchet, a couple of other terms for the fighting equipment and so on. There's a word for breeches, the pantalon, that's the Italian, but there's a word that the Franks use, so. But almost nothing. They took over lingua romana bassa. That's what they called it. That's what scholars call it. lingua romana bassa, low Roman tongue. Now, this low Roman tongue gives us our sophisticated, wonderful, not to be equaled modern French. Sorry, I can't get any rise out of you at all. Because you don't think that about modern French. You let me say that, you don't even think it, right?
We're just being polite, Gene.
I thought you were going to sleep. You know, the French have a saying, and I'll just give it to you and then we'll go on. That which is not clear is not French. Say again? You can't change it. No, you can't change it. Okay, so now we've saved Christianity. Do you agree? Arianism was not Christianity as we know it. The triune God, the Orthodox Roman Catholic, that's saved for Western Europe. Now, it wasn't saved for, I'll get to you, Don, just a minute. It was not saved for Turkey and that area where the Greek Orthodox, etc., and then the Russian Orthodox, but it was saved for the Romans. Don, you got a comment?
Yeah, one could argue that Arianism is more in accord with the book of Mark, where God anoints Jesus as his adopted son, and maybe Arianism is really the pure Christianity.
I agree with you, but we won't go there. That's rather too... Don, you stick to your controversies and I'll stick to mine. Well, you know, let me give you one more anecdote. It's not really in the program, but I like to do ad lib things. You know, a guy who we celebrate occasionally, around Valentine's Day, St. Valentine. That's not the guy I want. I want somebody else. The one who threw coins down and it went through a stocking and landed in the little poor girl's socks. And who was that? Santa Claus. St. Nicholas, of course. St. Nicholas. Now, good old St. Nicholas was at the Nicaean Council, along with lots and lots of other bishops and Arius. Now, the anecdote goes, somebody wrote about what happened there and said that they got in such an argument that St. Nicholas punched out Arius right there in front of everybody. Now, that's not consistent with his, bringing presents to the poor, but it is an interesting, a different view of St. Nicholas, a fervent believer in the triune God. Now, here's another one. We've got to save Christianity twice, right? Because I promised you. The year 700, all that fast, it stormed through North Africa, knocking everything out of the way, destroying all the Christian buildings and converting people, all the way across to Morocco, up to Spain, go up to the Pyrenees, go across the Pyrenees. This is the Saracen now, that group of Islamic folk, and they go into what would become France today. Narbonne, you may have heard of, but if you haven't, that's okay. Toulouse, you've probably heard of. Destroyed those two towns, headed toward Paris. They were intent on taking over what is today France. And then eventually they would want to go across the Rhine and keep going, because the idea behind Islam was to conquer the world. Still is. So people are falling right and left and succumbing to them. And the bishops again start yelling up to Paris to the king, you got to do something. Well, the kings, unfortunately, after Clovis and a couple of his descendants, a guy named Dagobert and so on, but eventually get to the point where they're called fainéants. Fainéants, do-nothings. They did nothing. They were rather impotent kings, but the major domo of the palace began to take the reins, and one of the metrodomo was a guy named Carlos, or Carl. We call him Charles. He said, I will train an army, I will teach them how to ride like the Arabs and fight on horseback, and we will go meet them. When he finally got them trained enough, he met them at the town called Tours. You ever heard of Tours? On the Loire River? Ever heard of Poitiers? Sometimes they say the battle was in Poitiers. It was actually out in the middle of nowhere between Poitiers and Tours. So he met Alaric and the Saracens, and a great battle was won by Charles. And there is Charles, and we call him Charles Martel, because that's the word in Old French for a hammer, not the modern French, but the old French. And he was the one who was the leader of the army. He was not the king, but because of his success, his son became the king. His son is Pépin. Pépin. So Charles the Hammer became #1 favorite hero in French history and in Western European history, because he did save, well, I mean, suppose somebody else might have eventually stopped the Arabs. I mean, that would have been likely. But at least, as far as history is concerned, he's the one who stopped them and sent them back down below the Pyrenees. Okay, so they went back down below the Pyrenees. Pépin, I love Pépin. He was a short guy, so they called him Pépin le Bref, brief in English. And he married a woman called Bertha, good Frankish name. Bertha, but she had big feet. She was called Berthe au Grand Pied, Bigfoot Bertha. Okay, now that's funny, but the two of them ended up making a son called Charlemagne. So that wasn't too funny, because Charlemagne, as you know, was in medieval time by far and away the greatest military leader and perhaps the most enlightened monarch in all of Europe. He was crowned on the day 800, Christmas Day 800, by the Pope down in Rome as the emperor, get this, the emperor of the Holy Germanic Roman Empire. It's a mouthful, isn't it? The Holy Germanic Roman Empire, which existed until Bismarck, 19th century. And there were many, many different emperors through that time. But here's old Charlemagne, the first emperor of what is now basically the European Union minus all that stuff on the periphery that they've added. The first 5 are now not counting. Now, of course, England is out. But when the European Union was first formed, it was pretty much Charlemagne's territory except for England. Now, of course, there's 20-something countries, so it's well expanded beyond. But Charlemagne controlled all the way over to Poland and all the way to the Channel, did not control England. There was no way he was going to even try that. Tried to get Spain, though. He didn't like it because those people were still Islamic, and still the Christians were still there. The Islam folks were nice enough to not kill all the Christians. Didn't kill them even in Jerusalem for a long, long time, and then the Turks came in, caused the Crusades, but that's a different story. So Charlemagne set up a plan to conquer Spain. So he goes through a pass. There's not many ways you can get horses and wagons and supplies and everything else across the Pyrenees. But he did in a pass that was called Roncesvalles. Roncesvalles. That really translates to the Valley of Thorns. Not that that's important. So he goes through this pass, gets down, and he fights the Saracens. And he fights the Saracens, and he fights the Saracens. But he can't really get rid of them. Reason being, he can't. His supply lines are no good. He gets down there, and they can live off the land for a while, but you can't keep supplying yourself with the weapons you need and the horses you need and so on and so forth. You can't get them across the Pyrenees. So eventually he says, okay, I've got to take my army back across. So he has a nephew. And his nephew, his name Roland. Roland. Heard of Roland? Good French name today. Roland is his nephew. Now, he needed a rear guard to protect the flanks and the rear of the troops as they're trying to get back across with their horses and wagons and equipment and so on and so forth. So he tells Roland, okay, Roland, I want you to fight a rear guard action and keep them off our tail. But if you get seriously into trouble, if they overwhelm you, we talked about all that, so I'll get through it. If they overwhelm you, blow your horn. He had a horn. Now, what kind of horn did he have? He had a horn off of cattle. You know, it's pretty hard to blow that thing, but blow it loud enough, and we'll hear it way up ahead, and we'll come back. That was the horn, was it? You scared me for a minute. Uh-oh, there's the horn again. It was a lot louder than that. Well, there's a saga, the most famous medieval saga. Well, one could argue that King Arthur had as equal an important saga, or sagas, hundreds of them. The Matter of Britain, it's called, all the stuff about him. But Charlemagne had also an equal amount of sagas about him. But the one that everybody knows in France, if you say Roland, man, they pop up and they can talk to you for 5 minutes about Roland. Because over the years, troubadours and trouvères, which are just the ones living in the north part of France. They weren't called troubadour, they were called trouvère, and they recited or chanted, sang stories about Roland and Arthur and the battles and so on and so forth. So pilgrims, and we know that Canterbury became a place where people took pilgrimages, because if you were a good Roman Catholic, one time in your life you had to go on a pilgrimage. You had to save up money and go on a pilgrimage. Well, if you lived in France, chances are good that you went down to Saint-Jacques de Compostela in northern Spain, just north of Portugal. Or there was no Portugal at the time. Saint-Jacques de Compostela. Now, if you started out from Paris, all of these pilgrimages started with leaders, so they would go in small groups and spend the nights in inns. So all along, entrepreneurs would build inns for people to come and spend the night and eat and spend money and buy a T-shirt. At least some of you are awake. So these troubadour and trouvère wanted to make a living too. They had their lyre, and they told lies. I mean, they told stories about Charlemagne. And they told particularly about Roland's last stand against the Saracens. And eventually, this started out, say, 900 or something, and went on and on and on. And along in the 12th century, somebody took it on them to write these in Norman French. Norman French, because there's lots of different Frenches in the 12th century. Picard and Champagne and Burgundy and Aquitaine and so on. But it so happens that Norman French is somewhat easier to read than some of the other dialects. So here we have then somebody writes down in about 5,000 lines the Song of Roland. Now, how could you have 5,000 lines about this story? Well, you got to elaborate. Remember how these things developed. You probably heard it and forgot it. You go to an inn, and there's a trouvère or troubadour there, and people are sitting around eating their mutton stew, and he's telling them a story. Now, he knows the outline, but he tells it in his own terms, in his own way, see? So every inn you get a little different version, and a little bit this, a little bit that, But when the guy put it all together, he got it really elaborated, and there's all kinds of side stories and treason and this and that and the other. But the real story was this. Here's Roland, here's his horn, and he had about 25 good, stout, Frankish fighters, among whom was a bishop. And the bishop was about as good a fighter as there was, Bishop Turpin. You didn't think bishops fought? Boy, he fought like a lion. But anyway, the thing about it was, there they're crossing the Alps. Here's Roncesvalles Pass in the Pyrenees. Along come about 100,000 Saracens. And he's got 25 men plus the bishop, right? Now, if you hear the story, you say, well, 100,000 against 25 Franks, that's pretty good odds. So they obviously kill all the Franks except Roland. And he's wounded desperately. And he remembers Charlemagne told him to blow his horn. Now, his pride had prevented him from doing it. he wanted to go ahead and slay all the Saracens and by himself. So he finally said, okay, I'm dying, I might as well blow the horn. And he blew it as hard as he could. He blew it really, really, really hard. He blew it so hard, according to the story, that he blew his brains out. Blew his brains out. Is that right in the story? I wouldn't lie to you. I didn't write it. I did read it, though. So, Charlemagne luckily heard it. I don't know how they heard it, but they heard it, okay? You don't have a good story if you didn't hear it. So back he comes again to cross the path of Roncesvalles. Roncesvalles is a modern term, Roncesvalles. Come back and starts fighting. He's really mad. His nephew, his favorite nephew, the Bishop Turpin, all these guys. There he's crying, he's upset, he's terrible. He's going to kill all those Saracens. So he's doing it. I mean, he and his men are swiping them, killing them one after another with his big axe and all. Then it looked like the sun was going to go down and they wouldn't be able to do it. They wouldn't be able to get rid of all of them. So one of the bishops says, well, I'll take care of that. So he prayed to God to hold the sun right where it is until we get finished killing all these guys. Sure enough, the sun stayed right there until they finished their job. And that's the story. And that, I know you want to hear more, right? Is there any more? I don't think so. There he is blowing the horn. Oh, Charlemagne's watching baptism of pagan leaders. There is more to Charlemagne because remember he looked at the Saxons and the Angles, and they had this blonde hair, and he said about the Angles, he says they look like angels. But they march them down to the river, tell them all to go in and duck down under. When they come back up, we make them Christian. If they don't want to do that, they've got another choice. And that is to have an axe driven through their head. So he did a lot of baptisms, created a lot of good Christians. But he was more enlightened than some, more enlightened than Clovis. He created what's called the Carolingian Renaissance. He brought over from Ireland the only people who could really write. Everybody else had forgotten how to write Latin. He brings over there's a guy named Cahill that talks about how the Irish saved civilization. Anybody ever read Thomas Cahill's How the Irish? Okay, I see one hand. I know there are more. He's got a series, how the so-and-so saved civilization. The Jews, for example, Abraham, But anyway, Thomas Cahill, if you're interested, very interesting kind of writing. A little bit of generalization going on, but that's all right. So there is a Carolingian Renaissance. There is a new interest in learning, and we began there around 810, 815, before he died, to move little steps by little steps out of the Dark Ages. We're not going to get out of them until the 12th century, but we're moving in that direction. So Charlemagne is a man to remember. He not only spoke Frankish, but he spoke lingua romana bassa. And he tried to learn some Latin, tried to learn to read, but he was too busy killing Saracens to really do too good on that. Any questions, comments, anything? Throw it out there. Kent, I know you got a question. You're bound to have.
Current events, Toulouse is being flooded.
Toulouse is being flooded.
15 feet above flood level in Toulouse.
You know, he's doing this trivia thing with history, although that's not very trivial if you're living along the Garonne River, right? What's happening? What's going on? Just rain, 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 rain? Comes out of the Pyrenees, so maybe there's a lot of snow melt. Well, yes, here's a...
What was the final outcome of that battle?
Which one?
Saracens there.
The Charlemagne? Well, he killed a bunch of them.
No, but was there a treaty or anything like that followed?
He did sign a treaty and went back to France and stayed out from, and left them alone because there just wasn't a way, because of the Pyrenees, to sustain any kind of long-term warfare. It just wasn't possible. Logistics, hadn't come along yet. Even Napoleon had problems with Spain because of that, the logistics. Don.
The date for Charlemagne and the date for the Reconquesto, when the Christians took Spain back, what happened in between?
Now you want another lecture, I suppose. And that'll cost you. Between 815 and 1492, is that what you want? Kent, help me out. What's he going to read? He needs help. Any good book about that period? Ah. It's not mine either. Once Charlemagne dies, I quit. Pick up again with the 12th century. Yes.
There's a French woman author that writes about the period.
Run that by me one more time.
There's a French woman writer, and right now it's off my brain, but I've read several of her books, and she covers the period he's talking about.
A woman writer who covers that period. Yeah, there's a bunch of them. Anybody know what she's talking about? Well, anyway, don't want to belabor the issue. Thanks for coming. I hope that we'll get Dee back here soon, maybe in April, and hear what she's got to say. And remember, our next meeting, we have the talk about the Bonnet Park and all that creation that's going on there, which is going to really make Lakeland stand out in Central Florida, I think. People are going to want to come visit. So anyway, folks, thank you, and see you next time.